Well, what did the cat drag in today? It's a tutorial video on setting up a Plinko board. Now, a quick correction on the previous video for this tutorial sequence. I believe I referred to this as a Plinko game, or a Pachinko game. I always get the pronunciation on that a little bit wrong. That's not quite correct. In Pachinko, which is very popular over in Japan, you don't control where the ball drops from. But in Plinko, which is the game that I was referencing in The Price is Right, you do get to control where you drop it. So quick little correction there. We are doing Plinko, not Pachinko, because those two words aren't confusing at all. All right, let's get our board set up. I'm going to create a new scene, going to choose the standard built-in scene. I don't actually have changes to save there, so I'm going to tell it no. And of course, the first thing I want to do is save this scene out. As always, I strongly recommend that you always save your scenes into the scenes folder. Again, this is not functional, but organizational. Again, I don't need the skybox here, so I am going to get rid of it. Now, I already have some of my windows open. As a reminder, the lighting window can be found under Windows and Rendering. So I'm going to go to Lighting, I'm going to go to Environment, and I'm going to change the skybox material to None. I'm going to select my main camera, I'm going to change my clear flags to solid color, and I am going to change the camera color to black. And there we go. Now I have a specific spot that I want my camera. So I'm going to change its position to 0, 6.5, and negative 18.5. Now these exact numbers are not necessary. The goal here is just to get a good view of the game and to hide a few utility things. There's a couple of different parts to this scene that I need to set up. We need to set up the backdrop, we need to set up the side walls, the walls that separate the various goals, and the pegs themselves. I'm going to start off with the backdrop. Now for the backdrop, instead of using a cube, I am going to use a plane. Could I use a cube? Yes. But in this particular case, it's just a backdrop. I don't care how thick it is, so a plane makes a little bit more sense. It also matters in terms of your scale settings. If we take a quick look at a plane here, let me set that Y down to 0 so we can see it on the grid. If we notice a plane compared to a cube, just a slight size difference there, is there not? So keep that in mind. If you don't want to use a plane, your scale settings are going to be considerably different than the ones I am going to use. Now, since I want the camera pointing forward on the Z, so that way we can use gravity, I am going to rotate this up to negative 90 on the X. And then as far as my position values are concerned, I'm going to have a Y value of 8 and a Z value of 0.51. If I take a look at the game view, you can see that, okay, I can see the square, but that's obviously far too small. So for the scale settings, I'm going to set it to 3.5 and 3. Now it's going to take up the full view. And let me change to my 1920 by 1080 resolution. So there we go. It's going to take up the full view. If I hit the play button, it's always a good idea to periodically do that when you are working with visuals. I can see that, yep, okay, that is what I expect to see. And I'm going to rename the object to, not background, backdrop. Again, do I have to rename it? No. This is an organizational thing. Having backdrop, sidewalls, pegs is going to be a lot easier for me to find things if I need to modify stuff rather than plane, cube, cube 1, cube 2, so on and so forth. So there we go. I've got my backdrop. Now let's get these side walls constructed. Now for these, I am going to create a cube because I am going to need that thickness there. And for the scale on these, no, not a scale of 300, thank you very much. I'm going to put a scale of 30 on these. And then for my positioning, I am going to do that 15.5 and 8. And then for the other side wall, just make that a -15. And if I come in here and I look at it from the game point of view, I can see the side walls, but due to the angle, I can't see that little extra bit that's poking out on the sides. Next, I need the walls that's going to separate out where all the goals are going to be. Again, I'm going to use a cube because I need the thickness. And the settings for this one, for the scale, 0.2, 5.5, and 1 on the Z. It gets us a nice thin little rail piece here that the ball can bounce off of and gives us a nice clear separation. Now, it's not necessarily all that clear right now, but this is part of the reason why we need to put a backdrop, or put a material on our backdrop here. Now, for the position, I'm going to put this in the far right initially. .25 and 0. And I am on the backdrop. Thankfully, Control Z is our friend. So let me try that again. So this should be 9, -3.25, and 0 there. And looking at it, there we go, gives us a nice little slot right there. And then I'm going to duplicate. And I'm going to need a total of 4 of these. Now, taking out the duplication parentheses numbers is not, again, it's not necessary. I just like keeping things clean. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract 6 from the X on each of these. So this is going to be position 3. Mind you, you can also do equations as well. So I just typed in -12, and this would be -18. So that's a useful shortcut for assigning values in the inspector. You can put math equations in numerical boxes here. And there we go. I now have my goal walls separating everything out. Now, for the goal, I'm only going to create 1 for the moment. And that is because I'm going to have to put functionality on this. And so I'm just going to create the one goal for the moment and worry about duplicating it later. So we got 5, 3.5, and 1. And then for my positioning, I'll start this one off in the center. There we go. And if I look at here, I can see a little bit of the goal right there. And once it's duplicated across, it will serve its purpose just fine. And again, I'm going to rename that. Now, finally for the pegs, I'm going to put in 15 of them. 3 rows of 5. There's no particular magic to that other than wanting to have enough to provide some interesting gameplay, not having so much that I have to spend 10 minutes trying to get this to work, trying to actually test the logic of winning and such. So I'm going to create a cylinder. Again, reset the transform on this. Rotate it 90 degrees, so that way it is poking out like so. I'm going to roughly place them. They don't have to be exact. You could put them exact if you wanted. So I could say, all right, you know what? You are X6 and you are X12. As long as it's approximate, should be fine. And you can play around with this to see, how exactly you would want to have these listed out. Now this time I am going to get a little bit lazy and not get rid of the parentheses because, I'm going to have a whole mess load of them. There we go. And I'm going to put one extra in here because I don't want the ball to be able to get stuck on the side. So I am actually embedding these a little bit on the edge there. So that way if the ball happens to hit and sort of roll down the side, it will bounce off. There we go. 15-ish, well, closer to 16 actually. Little pegs for the ball to bounce off of. I'm going to take a moment here to do a little bit of scene cleanup and keeping things organized. I am going to create an empty game object. Call it _level. Again, that is a personal naming convention when I use empty game objects as quasi folders. And then I'm going to put the goal walls and all of that stuff in there. Now I'm going to create another empty game object for the pegs because they're kind of their own little mess there. So I'm going to create another empty. Call it _pegs. Again, reset that transform. I'm going to grab all of my pegs, drop them into there, and then drop that into level. Again, none of that has any functional purpose, at least not in this project. It's just to keep things organized. Now, the last thing that I want to put in here for this video is the ball. And I say the last thing I want to put in here is a ball, and I create a cube. I know my basic shapes, I promise. There we go, a sphere. That shall be called a ball. I am going to reset this. I'm going to put its Y value at 15. And looking at that, you know what? I think I am going to take the first row of pegs here, move them down a little bit, assuming that I can actually click on things. There we go. And move those down a little bit. So it's not quite so close to the ball dropping, so it has an actual chance to pick up some speed when it's dropped. Taking a quick look at game to make sure everything's still looking okay. And it is. And then I'm going to add on a rigid body to this ball. So of course that's going to give it some basic physics to it. And this also gives me an excellent opportunity to demonstrate why we're going to be adding a random torque and force to this ball when we drop it. Because if your ball and the peg are perfectly lined up, that happens. Also notice it didn't bounce. It just fell down and stuck. And if I offset the ball a tiny bit, so that way it won't stick, this is just kind of rolling off. I'm not getting any of that bounce that we were seeing. And to handle that, we're going to need some physics materials, which we'll get to here in just a moment. But as far as the actual geometry of this level goes, that's it. We've got our backdrop, we have our sidewalls, our pegs, our goal walls, and one goal that eventually needs to be changed to a trigger, but we will deal with that later. Let's just finish up a few things here, and then we'll be done with this video. We're going to want to get our material on the backdrop. We'll hold off on the materials on the goals because that's tied into the functionality of the goals. And we're going to want to get the physics materials onto objects as well. Let's deal with the physics materials first. Unity has this concept called physics materials, which define the friction and bounciness of a particular object as it relates to physics. This is an asset, so I am going to come down here to my project folder area, and I'm going to say right-click, create, and down here towards the bottom of the list, you should see physics material. Which I'm going to call ball. And we have a few settings here. We have a dynamic friction, we have a static friction, which this controls how sticky is something when it's moving and how sticky is something when it's not moving. And then we have a bounciness rating, 0 to 1. 0, which is the default value, as we've seen, indicates that there is no bounce. There is no force reflection when this hits a thing. But that's not what I want to have. So I'm going to make the ball very bouncy. I'm going to change its bounciness to 0.8. I'm also going to want to define a physics material for the pegs and my sidewalls. I don't need one for the backdrop because it really doesn't exist, at least as far as the ball is concerned. I'll get into that in just a moment. So I'm going to create another physics material, which I shall call peg. And I shall set its bounciness to 0.5. And I'm going to create one more. Called sidewall. And I'll set its bounciness to 0.2. I really don't want it to bounce very much when it hits the sidewalls. And I'm going to leave the goal walls on the default. The goal walls will have no bounce to them, or at least they won't contribute anything to the bounce. Because what I do not want to have happen is I don't want the ball to come down and somehow hit down here, trigger the goal, but still be able to bounce out and fall into another one. So these sidewalls are kind of going to act as dampers. They are going to really pull down the bounciness by being at the default of 0. To apply these, I'm going to look at the ball, and if you look at a collider, you'll notice there's a slot for material. The collider material is a physics material, not to be confused with the material that you see on the mesh renderers, which is the rendering material. So I can take my ball and slot it onto there. I can select all of my pegs at once. Since they all have a collider, and they all have this material property, I can select them all and do this all at once. And then I can take my 2 sidewalls and add their material on. So let's see how that changes things. And we might also see another error, possibly. Nope, we did not. But there we go. See how now the ball bounced. Go through that one more time. Yeah, instead of just sticking and rolling off, it did a little bounce. And if I put my ball back perfectly centered, like it was before, there we go. Now, there is one setting that I forgot to make when we created the ball that we are going to want to do. I only want this ball to be bouncing around and moving in the YX plane here. I do not want to take the chance that the physics system is going to send the ball in the Z direction. And so on the rigid body properties for the ball, I am going to freeze its Z position. So again, when you freeze something on the rigid body component, you are telling the physics system, and the physics system only, to not change that value. Its rotation, I don't care about. It can rotate however the heck it darn well pleases. I just want to make sure that that Z position is frozen so that the ball always stays in this XY plane here. So that's it. I mean, that's physics materials. They're a pretty simple thing. They're an easy way of adding a little bit more physicality to a physics object. There's really not much to them. I mean, that's it. We're done with them. So let's get our backdrop material set up. Again, a material is an asset, and it is a combination of a texture, or a flat 2D image, and a shader, which is a set of instructions to the graphics card on how to handle the combination of a 3D mesh and the 2D texture. We're going pretty rock standard for this. So I am going to create a material, kind of sort of in the center here. I'm going to call it backdrop. Now there are a ton of options here. We're only going to mess with 2 of them. One is the shader. Remember, that is the set of instructions to the graphics card to tell it how to deal with the combination of the 3D mesh and the 2D texture. It also contains a lot of instructions on how to deal with light and reflections and a bunch of other stuff. I am going to change the shader from standard to unlit texture. Why? Well, I just want this backdrop to be flat. I don't want this backdrop to be impacted by lighting. I want it to be a just uniform, flat color that, the texture. I just want the texture on there. That's all I want. So that's why I'm going to change the shader, the instructions, to unlit texture. And then I will assign my texture that I have from NASA to this. Now, in this particular case, since there's not a lot of textures in this project, I can just click on the select button here and select it from this list. Remember, you always have the search bar here if you have a lot of textures, because you're doing this in a project that has a bunch of other assets imported in. You can always type in a part of the name to filter it out, or just drag it in there. And then to apply this material, probably the easiest way is just to drag it into the scene and drop it on the backdrop. You can also select the backdrop and expand out the materials property on the mesh renderer and replace the listed material here. And there we go. Now it's a lot easier to see everything with that backdrop on there. And it looks like it's sticking out a little bit. So, not a particularly big deal, but I can shrink that down so that way it's not going past the edges here. And that's it. We have our level set up. So on the next video, we're going to take a look at getting the ball set up for being able to move it left and right and releasing it. And if you found this video useful, thumbs up would be appreciated. But if nothing particularly great was learned, the thumbs down button is right next to it. See you in the next video.